Yeah, exactly.
All right. Good morning. It's great to see you. It's great to see you. And I'm going to start by apologizing for the seminar being like 3 weeks late. And that was my optimistic scheduling. I said yes before I talked to these incredibly busy people. And of course, that was slightly sort of a little bit optimistic. So we had to postpone. And for that, I'm really happy to see you here. And this is a seminar that is not really a launch of this book. It's more that we published this book, Democratic Backsliding in Africa, Autocratization, Resilience, and Contention, that we're going to talk about today. But it actually gives us an opportunity to talk about one of the things that I think I want us to talk so much more about, and in so much of a more different way. Easily spoken. 20 years from now, every second person on Earth is going to be born on the African continent. It's going to be the continent with the youngest population. What does that mean? No, it does not mean drowning bodies in the Mediterranean. It doesn't mean big bellies, people starving to death. It means innovation. It means this is where almost every new idea is going to come from. This is going to be our solutions to the green shift. This is going to be where new ideas for public transportation, recycling, what have you, is going to come from. We need to gear up for that, and we need to actually, we need to start thinking about the partnerships and the collaborations that we can have and we should have. And I think, to be very honest, for the last 20, 30 years, we've been, I don't know if I want to say sleeping. I just want to say that we've given over this kind of agenda to China. And China has kind of utilized this opportunity. China has been, fostering these economic research partnerships, whereas we've kind of been stuck in a little bit of a sort of an old-fashioned aid, sort of top-down aid perspective. I'm speaking in really big ladders, and you can all disagree, but the point of departure that I really want to start this conversation with is that I think that we need a new conversation about how our relationship and how we can foster great partnerships in research, in innovation, technology, and what have you. To be honest, this place and the universities are the most fabulous places for having these conversations. But also we need to gear up, sort of shift gear. We need to have it. We need research partnerships that are much more anchored in universities and in research institutions in the global south. And part of what I wanted to do today is sort of start that conversation. So, because I think this book, Democratic Backsliding in Africa, has a question mark at the end. We'll get to the question mark. This comes out of a research project that had a fantastic title, thanks to Siri Gloppen, and it was called Breaking Bad, Understanding Backlash Against Democracy. Bad being backlash against democracy. So we were, I think, when we submitted that proposal to the Research Council, I think the title sort of, at least it got us a foot in the door. So this is because of COVID, it turned out to be a 5-year research endeavor. I was part of it. We'll introduce you all in a little while. And as a joint project of the book, of the project, we published this book, which basically takes maybe, potentially for all of you, a little bit of a surprising turn. Because we argue in this book, in the first chapter, that looking at democratic indices, we can talk more about those because they've come under quite a bit of attack lately. But looking at democratic indices, the VDEM, the Polity, the Freedom House, for sub-Saharan Africa, there is actually not a very distinct sort of downgrade. There is no distinct backsliding. There is another there's a very kind of an unfortunate term that we've used, which is, but it pictures as well, it's the flat line. What does the flat line mean? That's, you know, you all seen Grey's Anatomy and other things, right? Flat line just means when the heart stops beating, you know, when the line goes flat. Well, the democratic indice lines that we've looked at are flat. But that is the starting point of this book. That really just belies the entire story. And this is what we're now going to get to, and with my partners on the panel. What we argue in this book is that this sort of status quo democratic trajectory that we see for the continent and the cases that we will be talking about, sort of under that hides all the kind of democratic battles that has been going on. So basically, it hides how incumbent leaders have really sort of suppressed democracy, suppressed demands for democracy that have come from civil society, and that should have happened in a sense because of economic growth and more urbanization, all the sort of standard characteristics. But so it's been sort of systematically suppressed by incumbents, by two mechanisms. And the two mechanisms that we see, and which sort of puts the African continent and this conversation very much into the sort of big geopolitical talks that we have today. The one is the sort of systematic suppression of rule of law and of courts and legal institutions. Get back to that, Siri. And the second one is how one has incumbent leaders have used incumbency and sovereignty, sort of state sovereignty, as a kind of a, what can I say, sort of weapon of defense towards international partners and donors and UN and what have you, to sort of, but then again, used to contain their power against demands from civil society and what have you. So these international linkages very much tied to a notion of sovereignty, which I think is something we should discuss more, because it's the way sovereignty has been used is actually also a little bit sort of self-serving, and it's not really, it hasn't, while it's important, it hasn't really been used necessarily for democratic purposes. But these two mechanisms, how incumbents and also, I'll get to opposition, the two maybe most important mechanisms, the use of legal instruments and the use of international relations. And sort of, this is in our book, this is our argument, this is where the battlefield for democracy has sort of taken place. And because of that, the interesting, so there should have been, in a sense, with economic growth, with urbanization, with a young population, there should have been much more sort of democratic growth. There should have been more democratic development, but it's been suppressed. But the interesting thing, and where I'm now turning to my panel, my beautiful panel, is that these mechanisms are also the most important for the opposition. So basically, and I'm going to have to turn on my taking my glasses. So basically, this is the kind of democratic battlefield that we see. But so before then, I turn to Siri Gloppen, that you all know. Siri is I should do the formal introduction, right? So she's my colleague. She's also the Dean of Research at the Social Science Faculty and the Director of Law Transfer, and a very important part of this book. The second panelist is Matthew Gitoy, who is, everyone here knows, he's a researcher at CMI. He is also a very important partner in the Breaking Bad project. Do I have Sabiti on the line? No, I don't. So the third party is from Kampala, and he was going to be on the screen just now, but he may just show up. So Siri, just a second. There it is. What happened to my question? I had such a brilliant question for you. But so why don't I start while I sort of desperately look for the question and say, Siri, I've kind of introduced the legal mechanism as one of the sort of main battlefields for democratic, the sort of fight for democracy. One of your sort of key claims is, this is a key claim from you, but you also say that it's the most sort of important mechanism for the incumbent, the ones who wants to keep power, but it's also the most important battlefield for the opposition, civil society, minority groups, and so forth. So can you just sort of explain this? Why is this such an important battlefield? Sorry.
So sometimes we're very unorganized society.
Yeah.
So just think of here. The court is super important for democracy. They're important in elections, and they're important in many ways, and it's more or less the same thing that happens in many other countries. And I think to understand why this is so, we need to think about what the law is for. Law is the framework for government. It's a tool for the government to use. It's just a real tool. So use through law, through institutions, through law, it creates predictability, it gives power to the executive consent, it gives power.
Oh, we haven't played handball for a long time.
So it's actually what the it's me.
But she has two microphones. This is not working?
No.
Oh my gosh.
It looks like it's working, but is it?
Yeah.
It is working.
Now
I just need to keep it close. So think about this: that law and constitutions are the framework of governance in a state. So the state needs it. It needs it to rule. It needs it to control its own state apparatus, and this creates the terms of the relationship between the arms of the government, but also with the people. And it is also what gives legitimacy to the state, and to a large extent, because it defines the terms. So in a lawless society without any law, the state wouldn't be legitimate to rule, and it wouldn't be able to rule. And that is also why it's important for states who want to control. And the state can use laws in very many ways. So they can gear. I mean, legal sociologists often say that law is frozen power. So of course the law is made. It's not given. And some is internationally made, and there are international commitments, and that's important. But there are also a lot of laws and constitutions that are made and remade in each society. And that is what the government does. So the governments in Africa, as elsewhere, they use constitutional reform, legal reform, to make laws that are sort of geared for their purposes. And often you can see that they will use public order laws in order to be able to control societies. They will use the criminal law. I mean, yesterday, the Ugandan, I mean, we have Ugandan lawyers there, but Ugandan parliament passed sort of a new anti-homosexuality law that makes a lot of civil society activities around LGBT rights criminal and punishable by prison, and also in addition to same-sex relations. So all of these ways of using the criminal law is important because it's ways to control society. And at the same time, of course, for opposition, the law can also be used for protection, because the law also gives rights. The law also defines a space for public activity. And if you think about most states also are party to international treaties. So at some level, they will have human rights provisions in their constitutions that will be more or less effective. But there are always elements in most societies, and in all societies, there are elements of the law that are protected and that they can be used by the opposition. And of course, this is also something we know if we look at the US, for instance. We know that you can appoint, the government appoints judges, and they can appoint the judges they want, but it takes a while because judges sit for a long time. You have to appoint people who are lawyers and who have qualifications, which means you have a limited pool. You often have people who have sort of more liberal values in many cases who are in courts, and the collegium of courts and in sort of the international and regional collectives will create sort of this, will make courts often more ready to accept arguments from the opposition. Not always, not if the stakes are very high, but often they will also be able to sort of gain ground. So I think this is the main reason why it's so important, and also that all society have courts. I mean, we need it for dispute resolution. So they have often a very sort of even in societies where institutions are weak, courts and law are often sort of stronger institutions in a way. Doesn't mean that often the government is stronger, so they will be able to use it more to their effect, but they're ambivalent in this respect. But of course we know, and this is for many of the societies that we've looked at and countries that we've looked at, for instance, during elections, the courts will use the criminal law against opposition politicians. This is also not only in Africa. I mean, I think that the law, not this last election, but the election before in Brazil, we also have Brazilians here. when the judiciary used its powers against the candidate Lula, who's now president, but who wanted to run for re-election using the corruption law. The use of corruption law is very much, I mean, that we see that in so many African countries as well, that it's strategically used. Prosecutions. The government often controls the prosecution, or normally, and in these countries, and it means that they can press charges. Very often for corruption, sometimes for rape or for treason, quite often treason, and then sometimes there is this fight where the courts try to give bail so that they can continue the elections. But this is a very effective way. So even if they don't get convicted in the end, they can't really do election campaigns. So all of this, so it's just a very useful tool. And the last thing I'll say is that it's also, if you rule by law, it's not necessarily rule of law, but you rule by law. And if you use the courts, you can't really be criticized so much. So you can't really, you can be criticized for pressing corruption charges against the opposition, but of course they might be corrupt. So you might, it's not clear that this is sort of wrongdoing by the state. So there is this advantage both domestically and internationally by using the law.
Fantastic summary of one of our key points in the book. And you touched upon my next sort of real key point in our research, and which is where I'm now getting to Matthew, and which is how states have used sort of gender rights and not least LGBT rights as a way, or to criminalize LGBT rights as a kind of a key tool of autocratization. Now, I think, to be honest, I'm saying that a lot of innovation is coming from the African continent. I'm sad to say this is also one of the innovative points, because Zimbabwe was way ahead of Putin and Orban and all the others in sort of using gender and sexual minority rights as kind of weaponizing the opposition. And so, and this is a key sort of element and the key concept of our book, showing through all the chapters how the state has sort of used criminal law, as Siri talked about, in a kind of, as a mechanism of sort of containing democracy. So Matthew, you've done a lot of research in this field, and why is this such an incredibly useful tool for autocrats? And maybe, sort of general response, but I would love you to sort of say a little bit about your work in Kenya in this field, and also then we link to what's just happened in Uganda.
So thank you for that question.
Or these questions.
On these questions, subpart A, B, C, and D. No, and thank you to everyone for being here so early in the morning. Hopefully the coffee. So I think I'll start off with the point that Siri made towards the end, right? Which is that there is these courts are being used strategically, or these laws are being used strategically. And if we think about social norms in particular settings, then there is a desired interest by these incumbents to, one, signal to their local populations that the norms are being held in place, and two, and if these norms are being potentially changed through pressure from outside institutions, that they do have a way to push back. So when we think about LGBT rights, Zimbabwe being one which started in the late 90s, politicizing it during elections, this was a pure electoral strategy. But also this was a time when the Europe was starting to pressure, in early 2000s, Europe was starting to pressure African states to be more welcoming and more welcoming to LGBT communities. And aid conditionalities were being tied to it. So this is when we start seeing the international aid dimensions coming in. The problem is the domestic backlash that happens, right? So if a country is in need of aid and an international country comes in and says, or donor comes in and says, you have to liberalize. And one of the ways of liberalizing is proving your pink credentials, right? So that you are accepting and comfortable with LGBT people. Otherwise, you will not get any aid. Imagine how this plays out domestically, right? The rhetoric becomes very much, it is because of this particular group of people that we are not getting aid, right? So then there's backlash that happens to that community. Beyond using them as a pawn, right? In the courts, there's also legislature, right? So embedding these laws in law, so then that way it's very difficult to come back and overturn them, right? It shows that there's a signal here that this is being approved by the people you have voted for. It is not something that the incumbent has come up for, right? These are your representatives you've elected, and so this is how we are going to maintain the social norms in our society. So that is the one extreme, right, which is the LGBT community. But there's also women who are very much being used as pawns in these strategic games by incumbents. And this is where they, as they become more and more autocratic, they use women in cabinets, right, leadership positions, to signal again to international communities, right, that yes, we are doing the right thing, at least autocratically. But as more and more women get into power, we would expect that the policies would change, right? But if they are getting into cabinet, sometimes they are relegated to very non-patronage rich ministries, right? So these governments are strategic in when they use women, right? So there's new work that shows as the level of aid increases in a country, then you're more likely to see more women being appointed into ministries. Right? But then if an autocrat is in a state of weakness, then you will not see them appoint women, right? So women are being used very strategically to signal to international communities when aid is coming in. Yes, we are doing the right thing. Yes, we do have more representation. We're trying to combat gender equality. But because these ministries are very often used to bargain between elites, right? When they are weak, then this prized possession is not going to go to a woman. It's going to go to a male competitor who can be bought up and co-opted into government. Right? So we need to think about what is the end goal for these incumbents, and how are they using different gender identities, right, women and or sexual minorities, to achieve their goal, which is often to stay in power and consolidate their grip on power.
Can I just have a small comment to that?
Are you ready, Vibeke, for...
Sabiti, can you turn on your camera, please?
Is online now as well.
Sabiti is online too.
Yeah.
Good.
No, just a small point, because I also think we have with Elina, we have had this this project on with women in judiciary, women on the bench. And one of the things that we see is that in some cases is that, so of course, if judges are appointed who are really close to the government, that sometimes raises a lot of criticism. But if it's a woman, that creates a bit of a sort of cross, sort of the krigspress, I don't know, like cross pressure, because then the society will welcome women judges, but so there will be less pressure, there will be less criticism for appointing sort of very loyal women. And I think you see that sometimes in when it's in courts and so on in the political arena as well, that it's also a way of sort of hiding the fact that you're really handpicking your people.
Yeah. Excellent. I am going to, so you guys, it's almost like we had this conversation planned, because you, Matthew, just sort of gave the ball into the hand of Vibeke Wang, who's sitting here. Can I throw this down to you?
I can.
Because so Vibeke Wang is a senior researcher here at CMI, and she has also been part of. Do you want to sit here when you talk?
Or I can sit here.
And she's also, so Vibeke is a gender scholar and a political scientist, and this is exactly what you have, your research field. But so in this book project, Vibeke has also been an author of 2 country chapters, one on Uganda and one on Malawi. And the interesting thing is, those are kind of in our sort of arsenal of cases, are on 2 different sort of specters on the sort of democracy line. And so Malawi is the country that has sort of democratized the most, and Uganda is what we would in our sort of country case universe call a stable autocracy. But in both countries, gender both in relations to international partners, and it's been important for governments to focus on and sort of enhancing gender representation. So how does this look different in a more sort of stable autocracy and a more sort of liberal democracy, or at least on that spectrum? What are the big differences in terms of gender policies?
Yeah, thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Siri and Matthew. I thought it would, this is a good time to perhaps add a little bit to what you have already said. So I find it quite striking that in terms of gender equality in politics, at least, the stable autocratic case of Uganda has come further than our sort of democratic hope, at least in the book, Malawi. And in Uganda, for instance, the country was a pioneer in terms of adopting electoral gender quotas. So already in 1989, it adopted a quota policy, reserved seats for women in parliament. And this policy has been quite sort of strategically important for the ruling party and Museveni. So it has, at least after the introduction of multi-party politics, it has boosted the electoral strength of the ruling party. It has not only increased the number of women in parliament, who the majority belongs to NRM, the ruling party, but it has also reinforced patronage structures at the district level. So women are elected to parliament in district constituencies, but creating more districts have been a way of creating more jobs as well. At the same time, there are also sort of more positive aspects to this policy. So it has not only gained the NRM and the ruling party, but women activists have also pushed for this policy. And in parliament, we see actually that women have been able to pass important women-friendly legislation. So it has had a positive effect in that sense. Most importantly, perhaps, it has sort of normalized sort of the position of women in public space and in politics. And this is an effect that is often, I think, quite sort of underestimated, and we tend to forget that. So the picture is quite mixed and complex, right? And this is also why perhaps international actors have been so reluctant to criticize the way Museveni and the ruling party have exploited the quota policy to its own advantage. So in this way, you could say that the international actors have also been part of sort of legitimizing the NRM hegemony. As opposed to this, in Malawi, there's no similar quota for women in politics. It has never been introduced. So you find that major political actors, so maybe the veto players, have considered quotas as too controversial. And you find that gender quotas, if implemented correctly, can be quite effective and may challenge the status quo. And in power, you have a male elite that have been reluctant to do this. Instead, in Malawi, something called the 50-50 campaign has been adopted. So international and backed by international actors. This campaign has sort of provided women candidates standing for election with funding and also some campaign materials. And this has sort of also signaled internationally that, okay, we're doing something about the problem, but it hasn't really been very effective. And it comes with few costs to the ruling male elite, right? So overall, you find that women's position in politics is less prominent in Malawi than in Uganda. And it boils down to perhaps a political will, I think, to a large extent. So in Uganda, I mean, Museveni has been used the quota policy strategically to his own advantage. In Malawi, there just hasn't been the political will and self-interest in introducing such a quota. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And I just want to say before I give Siri the word, this what Vivek just describes about Malawi, it's also very similar to the case of Ghana. That is the most democratic of our country cases, where women, there are actually very few women in parliament. And so in this sense, they haven't succeeded. So the story that Vivek just sort of presented for Malawi could also go for Ghana. So before I give, I try to engage my partner on Zoom.
No, I just wanted to tie this to what Andrew just said, because I think one of the things that we need to say is that, no, I think this is what is that Malawi is a competitive system, which means that the stakes are higher. So and when you don't, there are many parties who try to get the place in parliament and try to win, which means that it's more important that you have the best people, which we always know so often is not considered to be women. So that is, and that's also of course why the judiciary has passed that in Malawi, because then this is the classic. You have more judicial independence than those in power, Sarah being out of power, because then they need protection the next time around. But interestingly, where in Malawi, women have been chief justices, which is not happening in Uganda. So there are sort of the gender politics plays out differently in Malawi, partly because the key thing, which is that Malawi is just more connected.
Excellent. We'll have more time, but I want to. Are we okay now?
Yeah, well, Saviti is on, but we haven't been able to get him on the camera.
Okay, but is he on sound?
I believe
So, Sabiti,
Yes?
good morning, my friend. I haven't seen you for a long time, and I'm not even able to see you now. But I am introducing to you my good friend and our colleague, Sabiti Makara, who is a professor of political science at the University of Makerere in Kampala, Uganda. And he has written on Uganda, the chapter on Uganda with Vibeke. And he's worked on sort of political trajectories of and sort of state-society relations in Uganda for many years. And I wanted to introduce him to this conversation to link to the second mechanism that we've been concerned about in this book. We talked quite a bit about the legal mechanism, and now I want to introduce and invite Sabiti to come in and reflect on the international mechanism. Matthew mentioned it quite a bit, you know, how this link to international aid agencies, donors, Western partners, whatever, plays up in in a domestic political debate. But so the question that I wanted you to reflect on, Sabiti, is how Uganda and the Uganda political leadership has sort of maneuvered their international partners in their, and to what a role it plays in what we call a stable autocracy. How important, so why hasn't sort of aid from EU and Europe and the United States and what have you, why hasn't it sort of pushed Uganda in a more democratic direction? Why hasn't it worked? And to what extent is, how important are Uganda's other friends, to put it that way?
I'm missing you all.
There you are, we can hear you.
Yeah, I'm missing you very much. Siri, Lisa, my friend Vivek, I'm missing you very much, but I don't know this young man.
Matthew.
See, you haven't
Matthew,
been
okay.
there for a long time.
I
Turn on your camera,
Matthew. Sorry?
Very
How
nice
are
to
you,
meet you.
Matthew?
I'm doing well, and yourself, sir?
Yeah, I'm doing okay. Great, I've been listening to the conversation, and I think it's really focused on autocratization. I'm glad to hear your voices. The conversation is going great. Now the question that Lisa is posing about the internationalization of issues in Uganda is very focused, and I think it's very important at this time for discussion. My colleague at the University of Birmingham, I've just forgotten his name, he has written a nice book about how Museveni was able to food donors, really, so to say, to project himself as a democrat, project himself as a peacekeeper in the region, and project himself as one who really works for economic empowerment, especially of the marginalized people, like women, like people with disability, like youth, and so on. And to a great extent, it seems like these international donors and partners seem to agree with him, tend to think that he's really doing a good job in the region. He's seen as a father figure of other politicians in East Africa and so on. They haven't tackled his issues, because when you see what is happening in autocratization of the country, you get really concerned, because one, if I can raise a few points, one, Museveni is increasingly taking power to his family. That is, his brother and his wife are like number two in the country. His brother, General Salim Sare, his wife Janet, and his son. These control power in Uganda, really, if you come to think about it. So whenever anybody wants something from Museveni, you either go to his wife his son or his brother. That is the extent to which this is now really narrowing it to, I think in political science, we call it an oligarchy. An oligarchy is really rising in Uganda. Just like to an extent it was in Zimbabwe. When you wanted something from Mugabe, you had to go to his wife. So that's what is happening here. But also, there has been a lot of weakening of the civil society. That is really the funding agency for civil society, for sexual minorities, as Matthew was discussing. It is becoming very tough. Yesterday, I think I haven't checked the news, they were supposed to pass an anti-gay legislation yesterday. I haven't checked the news if it was passed. But it was passed. I don't know. I haven't checked the news. So you can see that the minorities are getting sidelined. In fact, during the 2021 election, some of the civil society organizations which were really helping the people with in the sexual minorities, their monies were squeezed. They stopped their money. One of them was actually arrested. He's a good friend of mine. And his money, I think he had gotten like $1 million to support his causes, but the money was frozen. I don't know whether they now raised it, but it was very serious to that extent. If you see the women causes which my friend Bibek works on in Uganda, women now in parliament and other legislative bodies are really symbolic. Yes, the numbers have increased of women in parliament. The numbers of ministers have increased. Yeah, I think it's now 36%, if not 46. I mean, women are also in big positions, vice president, prime minister, deputy prime ministers, judges. But you know, they are like what I would say, like symbolic in government, really to give a picture that really women matter. But in essence, really, I think the mattering was there when there were even fewer in the 90s, because really women like this lady who is the head of the global HIV organization, she's a Ugandan. They were very powerful. Women were very powerful. Their voices were coming out strongly, and so on. But you know, now they have to cling on the aprons of the leader. You either agree with the leader or you can't do anything as a leader yourself, as a woman. And also to an extent, even men now, legislators, have to first read the mind of what the president wants. The freedom that these leaders had has diminished. Again, on the side of the international community, you can see DGF, which used to support civil society. DGF, Democratic Something Facility, was banned. Their money was frozen, and in fact, they have abolished DGF. DGF was a consortium of Western funders who were supporting democratization by supporting civil society, but also to some extent supporting government organizations which were working on human rights, like Human Rights Commission, like Equal Opportunities Commission, like prisons, like police. They were receiving money from DGF. And now, during the election, the last election of 2021, actually DGF was banned by the government. So they cannot fund civil society anymore. And the consequence is that many of the smaller civil society organizations or NGOs have run out of business because they can't run without funds they can't run their business without donor support. As far as the political parties are concerned, I think they are in serious quagmire because they cannot receive any money beyond 40 million shillings, 400 million shillings from one donor. And because of that, it becomes extremely difficult for the opposition, for example, to raise money for their activities. To a large extent, the opposition parties cannot be able to run offices countrywide and so on because they can't pay rent and so on. They can't fund their activities and so on because they lack money really. And you remember that there is also a law in Uganda which stops political parties from activism because that law is called POMA, political organization, political what? Yeah, I've forgotten the full title of the legislation that allows, does not allow political parties to be free to organize. And if you are going to organize, you must ask permission from the Inspector General Police. You can imagine a whole country, before you do anything, you must go to the Inspector General Police to give you permission to organize a small meeting of your supporters. So POMA is a disabling organization. I mean, a disabling law as far as the opposition is concerned, because for us who are around here, we get disturbed because the NRM organizes massive meetings all over the place. But when the opposition wants to organize even a small meeting, they must go through, they must get permission from the Inspector General Police, not a command of police at a small police station, no, from the Inspector General Police. Now back to the question of the response of donors. I mean, for many years, the opposition had always anticipated and they felt that maybe the United States, which is the biggest donor to Uganda, the United States gives Uganda every single year $1 billion every year, $1 billion. So if the United States was to withdraw their funding to the budget, there would be a crisis in Uganda, seriously. It means that the health sector would possibly collapse because like 90% of the money that they use in the health sector is American money. So the opposition had already said if the US withdrew or reduced their budget support to Uganda, the health sector and the military sector to some extent would collapse. A lot of money from the Americans actually goes into the military also, because they see Museveni supporting settlements, political settlements and armed settlements in these other countries like Somalia, South Sudan, previously countries like Burundi. The US gives a lot of military support to Uganda because Museveni does a bit of their bidding in these countries. He acts on their behalf to sustain peace in some of those countries. So many people hoped that if the US was to withdraw their funds in the military and in the health sector, then maybe these people who are in government would think twice. But it hasn't done so. In fact, when Biden was elected, many people felt, this time, yeah, the Democrat is in power. Let us see what he does. And he has done nothing. He instead recently invited Museveni. Museveni became a celebrity in America during the US Africa summit. Museveni was highly welcome and well treated. So, and recently, I think Blinken, the Secretary of the US, said, we are going to do business with Uganda. So the opposition is very highly disadvantaged. But there's also a question that Lisa raised when she was writing to me that I should comment also on the the Chinese influence in Uganda. But you can also talk of the Russian influence in Uganda. Let us begin with the Russians. Literally, most of the equipment, military equipment that they are using in Uganda actually comes from Russia. So Russia has a really significant influence in terms of exporting military equipment to the country. And I don't think Uganda exports much to Russia. But also the Chinese really have stepped in the country since the 2000s. Yes. Constructing roads, really taking on most of the tenders for construction of roads, and also to giving them political support. The Ugandan government, the Ugandan political party, the ruling party, has very strong links with the ruling party in China. So these parties are exchanging dignitaries and they have frequent meetings. So I think one of the reasons why America doesn't want to take a serious step to discipline the powers that be in Uganda is that they fear maybe stepping aside and then the Chinese influence simply increases. Because China is almost everywhere, the reconstruction of the airport, the roads, agriculture, especially aquaculture, the one of dealing with fishing and so on. And I mean, I cannot really exhaust the list of the projects that the Chinese are supporting. So even the president boasts about it. The president boasts about it and says, you Western donors, if you want to give us your money, you can stop. Because China doesn't give us any strings attached. China, for example, Museveni said, doesn't look into matters, small matters of local government, how we manage our local affairs. That kind of thing, the Chinese have that tendency to say they not interfere with the internal affairs of any country. That is the same policy they have been using in Zimbabwe, for example. So they are using the same policy in Uganda to say, even if the rulers are autocratic, we are continuing to deal with them. That's the Chinese perspective. So given that scenario of having an alternative to Western donors, the Western donors are also quite cautious, because if they withdrew en masse, then there would be a problem, because they would lose their, I would say, their diplomatic influence. Yes, their diplomatic influence. For example, the leader of the European Union, I mean the ambassador of the European Union, has been really trying to interject and to tell from Museveni that really you are going beyond. Because, for example, after the 2021 election, really many of the young people who were in the opposition were arrested, rounded all over the place and put in prison. Many of them have not even appeared in court for 2 years now. But the ambassador of the European Union put up his voice seriously. But you wonder, I have been wondering, the Americans, the British, who have really great influence in Uganda, have kept mute. They haven't said anything about some of these issues. Remember that even the judicial system has been really weakened seriously, because you can imagine that ever since Museveni has been there for 37 years, he has been appointing judges. These judges, the Ugandans call them kada judges, those who are kadas of the ruling party. Those are the ones that have been appointed, because the authority to appoint judges lies with the president in the final end. So everybody has to behave in a particular way so that the ruling party and the ruling people do not suspect them that they are maybe judging fairly if they judge for the opposition. For example, recently there is a case still really running where one of the judges that was going to deliver a judgment in favor of Bobi Wine, she was not allowed to read her judgment at that time. And since that time, she has been harassed. Sometimes her salary doesn't come. Sometimes her salary comes. The other day, she wanted to go to US for treatment. They denied her the money and so on. So she has been really harassed seriously. And they are now putting a case in the Judicial Service Commission. The Judicial Service Commission is the one which filters the judges and so on, the ones to be promoted and the others to be appointed and so on. So the Judicial Service Commission is saying it has a proposal to dismiss her from the service. A court of, a judge of Supreme Court, the topmost level of the courts. She's really suffering.
I hate this because I would love to listen.
Yeah.
Actually, to be very honest, Saviti, what he has done now, he has really, he has explained to you almost the entire book. And, Saviti's explanation of the various international forces, how they play up against each other, is basically an incredibly nice narrative of chapter 4. And I am so sorry, but I have to stop you because we only have a few minutes left. And there has to be a possibility for the audience to ask questions. So, Sabiti, thank you so much. And, we are going to have to continue this conversation. I think we have space for at least one question, maybe two.
But I haven't talked about Somalia and...
No, I know, but we have to schedule a new meeting. I mean, they're very strict rules. Because everyone is going to work now. So we have to have a new meeting, Sabiti. But now we have two questions. It's from Ellen and then Bjarte. Yeah.
Thank you. I have a comment first, and that is, I just want to thank you for, first say congratulations on the book. It's now the top of my reading list.
And it's open access, people. You don't have to buy it.
Yes, but I just realized how important it is to read books. And I hope this excellent panel is recorded, because it's like the perfect opening for a paper that we want to write on the Angolan courts. I mean, you have really laid out the most important push and pull factors in explaining why judiciaries really don't work so well, or how they can be co-opted by the opposition and used by the ruling party. So I just want to make a very short comment on the Angolan case. I just realized that one of the explanations why we have so many women in some states may not be political rupture, which is the assumption that we have been working on in this Women on the Bench project. It might be autocratic regimes, which is the main explanation. I mean, like Uganda, Angola has a lot of women judges all the way to the top. The president of the Constitutional Court, the vice president of the Constitutional Court, a woman was supposed to be appointed to the Supreme Court. And so it's not because they're women, it's because they actually favor the executive. And I think this is something that we can explore in much further detail. But the question that I wanted to ask, have you seen a connection between democratic development or lack of democratic development and increase of women judges? Is it the opposite of what you expect in your cases?
We'll take both questions to me. Are there any other hands that I saw that? Yeah. So I don't see any other hands. So I think you will have, and then we'll respond. So, and then we're sticking to time. Time is yours, unless you ask 5 questions.
Okay, thanks. So a question regarding what you just said, Saviti, but to all of you actually. What to do with Western aid, specifically Norway in this case? Do we set conditions for giving money to support democracy, and how to do it? To give more to civil society, gender, LGBT, and women, and so on. what do we do differently? Thanks.
Brilliant question. And we have like 30 seconds. Why don't we'll start with Matthew and then Siri, and then I'll see if there's a minute left.
So I think what Norway can do differently is that when we look at the rights of women and sexual and gender minorities, is that there's been a change, right? So initially, a couple of years ago, there was a very structural approach to it, which was you work from the bottom down, from the bottom up, and also from the top down. So you fund civil society organizations that deal with women in these organizations, empower them, give them capacity, but also work with the governments to create capacity for the competition, women in government, and things of the sort. Over time, we've moved to a very instrumental view, which is it's top down, you work with multilateral agencies that do these things, and then you step out, right? So I think there needs to be a return to that structural approach, which recognizes localization. Who are the women's organizations? Who are these grassroots organizations that need the capacity, know the local problems, and can actually start creating more impact at a local level, but also work with the governments and bilateral agencies to fund capacity building for the parties, for legislators, for the courts, and for the business sector, so that people can actually become more involved and have not just empowerment in a idealistic way, but actual empowerment in a practical and substantive way.
Thank you, Matthew.
No, so I just want to reinforce that. I want to say that, of course, there's no time. Yeah. And I think sometimes donors are just too impatient. And by being too impatient, it creates trouble on the ground. But I also want to say that what's happening in Africa now, for instance, in terms of backlash against sexual minorities, is not really anything that happens necessarily in that country. This is part of a global movement, and it's landing everywhere slightly differently. It's happening in countries where there is no active LGBT movement, where there is no politics. So it's part of an international trend, and that's important. And I just want to plug another book that Matthew and I have been part of, which is also open access and also just came, and that came out of a project here, which is called Queer Lawfare in Africa, which has country chapters on, I think, 15 countries, but showing, and also some overarching chapters and showing these dynamics. Because also here you see that they can be used, courts and law are used by both sides in different ways, but also that this is happening. There are some other forces that are actually landing here. And then to Ellen's question, this is really complicated because there are super independent women judges, as Sabiti was also mentioning now, that one of the judges who was sort of really independent in this case on opposition, on the central opposition figure is a woman. There are very independent women judges, for instance, in Uganda, but there is also this dynamic. So, and Uganda is super interesting because there was a very strong women's movement in Uganda, also as part, sort of from the 80s, as part of the liberation. That is also important to this story. So there are many different forces working at the same time. And I think so there is no one factorized explanation, but it is part of the story. It is important to look at.
With those words, because I am very conscious of time, we're 5 minutes over, and since this is a promise that breakfast seminars last for 1 hour, I'm going to thank my panelists. Sabiti, I want to invite you back because I want to hear much more. So stay in this space. There will be more seminars. Thank you, Sabiti. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Siri. Thank you, Vivek, who had to run for a meeting. Thank you, audience, for coming. And please download the book. Use it, read it. It's one of the wonders of Norwegian government policies that they pay us to pay publisher to publish open access. I don't understand how it works, but the point is literature is becoming free, and I think we should embrace that. So, and I also, just the last thing, I think Bjarte's question is it's huge and it's coming. And on the 27th, NUPI is organizing, and I hope it's online, a big seminar on Norway's Africa relations. Like, how are we going to think about, maybe, and going back to where I'm at, maybe so many things have become so instrumentalized, we really need to rethink it. But just watch out for on the 27th, it could be really interesting. And I think we should continue that conversation in this room. Thank you so much. Go and have a wonderful day. And for those of you considering a master program. There's a meeting at 10:15 at UPIL to talk about masters in political science.
But I also want to say that tonight, downstairs, no, it's not tonight, it's at 4. The film starts at 4:30. There is a documentary. We're starting Cine Latino. It starts tomorrow, but we're pre-opening. This is a documentary on Chile and Chile's constitutional process and how it failed. But with a discussion afterwards. So it's going to be super fun, and there will be pizza. So if you want to come at 4 downstairs, you're very welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you for coming. Very much appreciated. And thank you, Sabiti. Thank you so much.